How's it going, guys? So it's been a while since the last PoE video. We finally have another patch dropping on Friday, so I've basically compiled a list of different items that I thought would be useful with Mercenaries, and I wanted to share that with you, so let's get started. Alright, so starting off with weapons, we have Dying Breath. Now this staff gives us an 18% increase to our damage when we're close to our Mercenary. It also increases the effect of curses on nearby enemies by 18%, and on top of this, it increases the effect of our Mercenaries' auras by another 18%. Next up we have Kingmaker, which is a pretty expensive 200 axe, and for good reason. Kingmaker provides a lot of support for nearby allies. It gives us Culling Strike, allowing us to kill monsters below 10% life. It gives us an additional 50% to crit multiplier. It gives us plus 10 to fortification, making us take 10% less damage from hits. And finally, it gives us 30% more item rarity. Another weapon option is the Dark Seer, which makes enemies blinded by the Mercenary, have Malediction, and what Malediction does is essentially make enemies take more damage and deal less damage. Another weapon we could use is a Sign of a Sin Eater, and this basically makes it so that enemies inflict elemental ailments onto our Mercenary instead of nearby allies. And finally we have Conqueror Influence wands. Now these wands can roll Exposure on hit, Curse on hit, and increased aura effect. So to give you an example, a wand with Crusader influence could roll Lightning Exposure on hit, curse enemies with Conductivity on hit, and Wrath has increased aura effect. Okay, so moving on to shields, we have Brainrot Flag, which makes our Mercenaries' Warcries grant Arcane Surge to nearby allies with 10% increased effect per 5 power, up to a maximum of 50%. Now Arcane Surge increases our cast speed and our mana regeneration. Next up we have Redblade Banner, and this shield will make our Mercenaries' Warcries have infinite power. So this means that their Warcries will always provide the highest possible benefit regardless of how many enemies are nearby. So to give an example here, a Mercenary that has Rallying Cry will give us 4% of their main hand weapon damage for every 5 power, up to a maximum of 30 power. So with Redblade Banner, our Mercenary will always give us 24% of their main hand weapon damage every time they use the Warcry, since it gives the max power every time. Next up we have Matua Tapuna, or however you pronounce that shield's name, and this increases the effect of our Mercenaries' auras by 20%, and it spreads tar whenever they block, which reduces enemy movement speed. Another option is the Anticipation, which permanently intimidates enemies on block, so whenever our Mercenary blocks an enemy, it causes our enemies to take 10% more damage. Next up we have Broken Faith. Now this shield we can only use if our Mercenary has a way of creating Consecrated Ground, and what this does essentially is replace Consecrated Ground with Profane Ground, which is a ground effect that causes all enemies standing in it to have a 100% increased chance of being crit, and it also increases the effect of curses applied to them by 10%. Another shield option is Chernobog's Pillar. Now this gives a 25% chance for our Mercenary to curse enemies on hit with Enfeeble, and this is going to lower the enemy's damage and accuracy. Next up we have Dawnbreaker. Now what this shield does is scorches enemies in close range when our Mercenary blocks, and what that does then is reduce their elemental resistances. And lastly we have Centauri's Answer. Now this curses enemies with Punishment when your Mercenary blocks their melee damage, it curses them with Temporal Chains when they block projectile damage, and it curses enemies with Elemental Weakness when they block their spell damage. And what's good about this shield is that these curses ignore the curse limit, so if you're already applying curses to these monsters, then the curses from the shield won't actually replace those curses. Moving on to body armors, we have Garb of the Ephemeral, and this makes nearby enemies unable to deal critical damage. It also makes it so that nearby allies' action speed cannot be modified below base value, so things like Temp Chains won't have as much of an impact on you. Then we have Cosprey's Will. This allows our Mercenary to hexproof enemies, and it allows them to apply an additional curse. Moving on, we have Doriani's Prototype, which makes nearby enemies have lightning resistance equal to our Mercenaries, and we can use this to heavily reduce the lightning resistance of our enemies. Next we have Victario's Influence, and this increases the range and effect of our Mercenaries' auras. Next we have Redeemer and Hunter Influence Armor. Now this can roll nearby enemies are blinded, and if we pair this with Dark Seer, then all nearby enemies will have Malediction, and this can also grant an additional curse with the Hunter Influence. And lastly we have Eldritch Rare Armors, and these can increase the effects of auras and Warcries on our Mercenary. Alright, so moving on to helmets, we have Learcast. Now this gives us a juicy 50% increase to damage of nearby allies. Then we have Calm's Command. Now this makes nearby corpses explode when using a Warcry, dealing 5 to 10% of their life as physical damage. Next up we have a brand new unique coming to 3.26, and that's Howlcrack. Now this helmet makes non-instant Warcries have no cooldown, and increases the AoE of Warcries. Now this could pair really nicely with Redblade Banner. Another helmet we could use is the Blood Price Reaver helmet, and what this does is make nearby enemy monsters have at least 8% of their life reserved, making it a lot easier to kill them. Another great option is the Crown of a Tyrant, and what this does is make nearby enemies have 10% reduced all resistances, and it gives nearby allies a bunch of additional flat damage depending on the sockets on the helmet. Another great helmet is the Mask of a Tribunal, and this makes nearby allies have a 1% chance to block attack damage per 100 strength. It makes nearby allies have between 6 and 8% to critical strike multiplier per 100 dex that our mercenary has, and nearby allies have 2 to 4% increased cast speed per 100 intelligence our mercenary has. And lastly we have Influence Helmets, so if we use a Shaper Influence Helmet we can make nearby enemies take increased elemental damage. If we had a Elder Influence Helmet we can make nearby enemies take increased physical damage, and if we used any of the Conqueror Influence Helmets we can reduce nearby enemies' resistances. For example, a Crusader's Influence Helmet could reduce nearby enemies' lightning resistance. Moving on to gloves, we have Vixen's Entrapment. Now this gives our mercenary an additional curse. Next we have Gravebind, which makes it so that nearby enemies killed by anyone count as being killed by our mercenary, and this can pair really nicely with certain items. For example, if we used a Explodey Chest on our mercenary, then when we kill monsters it's going to count as our mercenary killing them, and then it's going to explode those monsters. Then we have Aseneth's Gentle Touch. Now this curses enemies with temp chains on hit, and enemies near the corpses that are affected by a mercenary's curses are going to be blinded, and these enemies when they're killed near these corpses they're going to explode, dealing 3% of their life as damage. And finally we have Hunter and Warlord Influence Gloves. Now the Hunter Influence gives a chance to intimidate or unnerve enemies on hit. I explained intimidate earlier, but unnerve causes enemies to take 10% more spell damage, and the Warlord Influence can grant Culling Strike. Now keep in mind all gloves can be corrupted for various curses on hit. Okay, so moving on to boots, we have Windscream. This allows our mercenary to apply an additional curse. We have Legacy of Fury, which scorches nearby enemies with increased effect, and has a chance for scorched enemies to burn surrounding enemies for 4 seconds after they're killed. Now this deals 8% of their life as fire damage per second. And finally we have Eldritch Influence Boots. Now these can roll ground effects, namely the drop spittle ground while moving effect, and enemies with the brittle ailment will have increased chance of being crit. As for belts, I've only got 2 here on my list, and those are Belt of a Deceiver, which intimidates nearby enemies, and Calm's Binding, which makes nearby enemies convert 25% of their physical damage to fire damage, which is a lot easier to mitigate. Also keep in mind that belts can be corrupted with increased aura effect. Moving on to rings, we have Doidry's Damning, and this allows our mercenary to apply an additional curse. We have Barracks of Spite. So when our mercenary kills a shocked enemy, an equivalent shock is applied to all nearby enemies, and when our mercenary kills an ignited enemy, an equivalent ignite is applied to all nearby enemies as well. Now this pairs nicely with the Gravebind gloves that I mentioned earlier. Next we have the Gratis Signet, which makes mercenary attacks apply Unnerve on crit, and mercenary spells apply Intimidate on crit. We then have Call of the Void. This makes it so that all damage with hits can chill enemies, and enemies chilled by the mercenary will then deal less damage, based off of half of the chill effect. Next up we have Original Sin, and this is an extremely expensive ring that's obtained from Sanctum, and what it does is reduce the nearby enemy's chaos resistance to 0. Next up we have Polaric Devastation, which either covers enemies in ash when our mercenary ignites them, which reduces their move speed and increases fire damage they take, or it covers enemies in frost when the mercenary freezes them, and that reduces their crit chance and increases the cold damage they take. Next we have Synthesis Rings. Now these can roll various curses on hit, and also intimidate enemies on hit. And lastly we have Conqueror Influence Rings. Now these can apply various curses on hit, relevant to the influence. For example, the Hunter Influence Rings can either apply Elemental Weakness or Despair on hit. Rings can also be corrupted for increased aura effect. And lastly we have Amulets, and to start things off here we have Zoth's Heart. So nearby enemies are going to be covered in ash, which reduces their movement speed and makes them take more fire damage, as I explained earlier. Next we have the Ignomon, which blinds nearby enemies, and this should work in combination with a Dark Seer. We have a Shaper Seed, which gives nearby allies 4% life regen and 80% increased mana regen rate. And you could also use an Essence of Horror on an amulet, which would give it a chance to crush on hit. Now crush is a debuff that lowers physical damage reduction by 15%. Also keep in mind, amulets can be corrupted with increased aura effect and additional curse. Lastly we have Perkwell's Toe, which makes nearby allies hits lucky, meaning our damage rolls on hits will be a lot higher. Anyway, that's all for this video. Hopefully it helped you guys out, and I'll see you in patch 3.26. Bye!